The first set of trials for January 6 defendants is coming up soon. Early April, I understand. And in some ways, this is good news. The January 6 defendants have been held, many of them, for months on end, in some cases well over a year. Rand Paul recently was on Fox, and he goes, it's ridiculous to keep people confined like this. People have a right to a speedy trial. They have rights to due process. These rights are being abrogated. And he says, quote, to abandon those principles for political purposes is to abandon the very bedrock of American jurisprudence. Well, I think it's fair to say that the left has done that. Now, I myself have said that it's a good thing to take some of these cases to trial for the obvious reason that it allows you to put the government itself on trial, to bring out the actions of the police and the government on January 6th. And this is something the January 6th Pelosi committee has been trying to conceal. They're sort of looking over here so you don't look over there. And a trial is a good mechanism to bring this information out. But in a recent article, Julie Kelly makes the point, and this is a very valid point, that this is a risky business because these trials are going to be held where? In Washington, D.C. Now, the point here is this. These January 6 defendants have already suffered the wrath of the D.C. judges. And by the way, even the Republican judges in D.C. become part of the swamp. They live in the swamp. They go to cocktail parties in the swamp. Their friends are swamp rats. And so they tend to absorb a kind of swamp mentality. And the people who live in D.C. no different. Now, the idea here is that they become financially dependent, career dependent on the government, on the trough, on the swamp, as we call it. And so, as a result, it becomes very much part of their psychology. Here's Amit Mehta, Obama appointee, talking about the January 6 defendants, and he says, quote, they told lies, they told falsehoods, they told our election was stolen when it clearly was not. Ha 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 ha. This is a topic that I'll be addressing at some point shortly. But nevertheless, D.C. is a place where 94% of the population voted for Biden. So it's no surprise that a number of the D.C. The lawyers for the January 6 defendants are like, listen, we demand a change of venue. We want to move these trials elsewhere because we are facing a hostile population, and the jury is going to be chosen from that population. So this is not really a jury of your peers. This is a jury that is very partisan for the most part, and one that kind of has, you may say, deep prejudices about how to think about January 6th. Now, when this motion was made before Judge Mehta, he's like, no way, I'm not going to move the trial. The jury can be fair. But Julie Kelly makes some key points here, which I think are worth noting. Number one, most of the potential jurors get all their information about January 6th from the D.C. media, and there's been a nonstop loop of hostile coverage that make these people seem not merely like people who are, quote, election deniers, but as domestic terrorists, as people who have posed the greatest danger to the Capitol since 1812, insurrectionists, and so on. Now, there was a survey conducted by Zogby that looks at the attitudes of D.C. residents, and apparently 74% of them believe that anybody who was inside the Capitol on January 6th should be convicted of insurrection. Think about this. Almost no one is charged with insurrection, but they should all be convicted of insurrection. And that would mean years and years and years in prison. 64% believe that even if someone did not commit a crime of violence, that defendant should still be held responsible for what other people did. Wow. I mean, talk about throwing out the simple idea that you're responsible in a court of law and in a system of justice for what you did, not what other people did. In one of the filings, one of the defense attorneys showed a comparison of attitudes between D.C. and Atlanta. And he picked D.C. and Atlanta because they have similar populations. They have a sort of a 50-50 black-white population. And yet in Atlanta, it's very interesting because while most D.C. residents consider January 6 protesters, quote, conspiracy theorists, most Atlanta residents don't. 76% of DC residents say that January 6th was an insurrection, but only 55% of Atlanta residents do. Again, when you're talking about are they criminals, are they white supremacists, you find sharp differences between DC and Atlanta, simply showing that there is a particular ideological complexion to Washington, D.C. Now, the reason I think these judges want to have these trials in D.C. is they don't want what you could call the Kenosha problem. What's the Kenosha problem? You have a jury of your peers. They look at the evidence. They look at what Kyle Rittenhouse did. They listen to the lying detective who goes, oh, no, those Antifa guys were just running in the same direction. They weren't chasing Kyle Rittenhouse. And the jury goes, nah, we kind of see them chasing Kyle Rittenhouse. We see him kind of responding to people who actually posed a threat. So that's what I call the Kenosha problem from the left's point of view, a fair jury that exonerates the Rittenhouse, and in this case, exonerates January 6th defendants by saying, listen, compare, when you apply an even-handed standard of justice, what you did compared to what the left is doing is a big fat nothing. Go home. You've already been incarcerated long enough. What the left really wants for January 6th is you could call it a Derek Chauvin verdict, almost a foregone conclusion, a verdict in which the jury is biased, the system is sort of set up in such a way that a fair assessment of what the defendant did is difficult, if not impossible. And that is, I wouldn't say that's the norm in every court case in America today, but that is now a feature, a staple, a regrettable staple of American justice.